Hi, I'm Nafisa Latic, and this is Across the Balkans. Today on the show, the Acropolis Museum in Athens is calling on the British Parliament to end a long-running dispute over a collection of ancient artifacts. Greece is demanding the return of the Parthenon marbles, relics dating to the 5th century BCE. But how did they end up in a British museum? And why is the UK refusing their return? It began more than 200 years ago when a British nobleman removed these sculptures at the Acropolis in Athens and transported them to Britain. Since then, they have been displayed at the British Museum in London. Greece has been demanding their return for nearly 2 centuries. The UK has rejected those demands, arguing that there is a greater public benefit in keeping them at the British Museum. But some in the UK also believe that the artifacts should be returned to Greece. In 2012, then London Mayor Boris Johnson said they should never have been removed from the Acropolis. And now, as Prime Minister, could Johnson take a step to end this long-standing dispute? We'll discuss this in a moment, but first, Fay Doulgkeri has more on the history of the marbles.
The Parthenon sculptures in London are some of the most famous disputed museum items in the world. Also known as the Elgin marbles, they were named after Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin, who removed about half of the Parthenon's surviving sculptures between 1801 and 1812 and had them transported by sea to Britain. Bruce insisted he'd removed them legally after obtaining an official decree from the government of the Ottoman Empire, which as a ruler of Greece at the time was the legal guardian of the sculptures. Bruce then managed to sell the Parthenon sculptures to the British Museum in 1816, where they sit as the centerpiece of its Greek galleries. And for nearly 2 centuries, Greece has been demanding the return of the 2,500-year-old sculptures. Melina Mercouri, a world-famous actress who was the Minister of Culture of Greece during the 80s, was the first Greek politician to raise the issue of the reunification of the sculptures on an international level.
Parthenon marbles are part.
In October 1983, Greece submitted a formal request for the return of the sculptures, and in April of 1984, the British side rejected the Greek request. It was the spark that ignited the repatriation debate that continues to this day. Last September, UNESCO urged the United Kingdom to reconsider its position and open a dialogue with Greece. But so far, no progress has been made. Archaeology professor Nikos Stambolidis is the new director of the Acropolis Museum. He explains why the monument should be reunified.
Εμείς δεν θεωρούμε ότι ο Παρθενώνας είναι μόνο ένα μνημείο ελληνικό, αρχαίο ελληνικό, ένα μνημείο της δημοκρατίας, αλλά είναι ένα οικουμενικό σύμβολο το οποίο δεν μπορεί να παραμένει μη ενωμένο. Εάν το Βρετανικό Μουσείο, ένα παγκόσμιο μεγάλο μουσείο, θεωρεί ότι με το να αποκόψει τη ζωφόρο, δηλαδή μια παρέλαση να το πω έτσι, και να εχμαλωτήσει ένα κομμάτι της αντιπροσωπεύει τον παγκόσμιο πολιτισμό, αυτό θα μου επιτρέψετε να πω ότι είναι λάθος, και είναι λάθος όχι μόνο από άποψη πολιτική, αλλά και από άποψη ηθική.
According to a British Museum spokesperson, the Parthenon sculptures play a pivotal role in telling a world story at the British Museum. Together with a wider collection, they help modern-day audiences see how the world they know is shaped by the past.
Οικουμενικό είναι ένα μουσείο που διδάσκει. Τι διδάσκει το Βρετανικό Μουσείο με τα γλυπτά, τα αρχιτεκτονικά του Παρθενώνα? Την κλοπή?
One of the oldest arguments from the British side was that the ancient sculptures couldn't be properly preserved in Athens. If the sculptures were to be returned today, they would be exhibited alongside the ones that remain in Athens. The Museum of Acropolis in the shadow of the Parthenon was inaugurated in 2009, and since then it's seen more than 15 million visitors from around the world. The third floor, where the sculptures of the Parthenon are exhibited, is the most popular. Many have expressed concerns about the sculptures returning to Athens, including Dominic Selwood, the author of Anatomy of a Nation, a history of British identity in 50 documents. He says the value of museums holding items from different cultures is that it helps us to see how human stories are interconnected. He said that if museums were emptied so they contained only local items, understand and learning about other cultures couldn't happen.
There are many objects from many countries that end up in other countries. That's just a function of history. So I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong in that happening. And often these objects act as ambassadors for their cultures, where they came from originally, when they get to other countries. And I think that there are complicated questions around thinking about something as belonging to a country. Because that starts to get a little bit nationalistic. It can become a sort of cultural nationalism.
Italian Mario Trabucco, a trained classical archaeologist, agrees. He strongly supports the Parthenon sculptures staying in the British Museum because he believes that part of their history shouldn't be brushed aside.
If we were talking about a monument being excavated right now, and you would say, okay, I'll take half and you take the other half, I would say, no, stop right there immediately. Because nowadays we have a sensibility that actually tells us the monument has a context, the monument has a unity, etc. But we, when it comes to the Elgin marbles, we are not talking about 2022. We are talking about 1801. And in 1801, some people did something that produced the effect of those marbles being partly in Athens, which in part saved them, in part allowed them to be studied, in part allowed them to be popularized in the exact way they are right now, inspire art and architecture. So all of these is history. It has a worth.
For the Greek people, the sculptures represent a very important part of their history and their identity. And according to a recent YouGov poll, many British people believe they belong in Greece. One of them is Andrew George, a former British MP and the chair of a group that wants to see the Parthenon sculptures returned to Greece.
It's always been the view of those of us of the British Association for the reunification of the Parthenon marbles, and indeed other campaigners, that the best position that the Greeks can take is to not rule anything out, to keep everything in play, but to obviously, the first recourse should be to pursue a diplomatic solution.
One thing Greece has ruled out is asking the British Museum to return the sculptures as a loan, because that would mean admitting they belong to the United Kingdom. Fragments of the Parthenon sculptures are scattered in several museums around Europe. Recently, the Archaeological Museum Antonino Salinas in Palermo returned a fragment of the eastern frieze from the Parthenon sculptures in exchange for a loan of a statue and a vase. The Acropolis Museum received the renowned Fagan fragment on loan for at least 8 years. The significance of this return lies in the prospect of it remaining in Athens, after the initiative launched by the Independent Regional Authority of Sicily towards the Italian Ministry of Culture. What remains to be seen is if London walks the path paved by Palermo. Fay Doulgkeri, TRT World, Athens.
Let's bring in Paul Cartledge. He is a professor of Greek culture at Cambridge University. Pleasure to have you with us, Professor. I know there are many people around the world who are big fans of your lectures about ancient Greek history. Great to have you with us. Now, who has the stronger case here, Professor?
Well, it depends how you make the case, doesn't it? in my view, and of course I'm in favor of the reunification of all the Parthenon marbles, not only what is in the British Museum, there are other bits of the Parthenon elsewhere outside Athens, including in Cambridge, by the way. But the case the British Museum makes is, in my opinion, very weak because it rests on a claim about legality. And if you go back to about 1800, there was no state of modern Greece. There was a state of the United Kingdom or Britain. And the British Museum trustees rely upon an Act of Parliament passed in 1816. We're now in 2022. Come on, British Museum, get real, get modern. Remember that we're now living in a totally different post-imperial, post-colonial world in which countries should do the decent thing, and it's not enough to go and steal, or at any rate take by force.
Let's go a little bit back to history. What was Lord Elgin's motivation in removing the marbles anyway?
Right. Well, quite a lot depends on how much trust you put in what he said about what he was trying to do. So we think, that is, we who are on the side of reunification, that actually his first motive, just like that of many of his fellow aristocrats, was to get hold of some nice Greek things to bring back to his home up in northern Scotland. So nothing to do with saving the sculptures for the nation, though he was, of course, our Britain's ambassador to the Sublime Porte, to the Ottoman Empire. And so his first motivation was purely personal. When that became unfeasible, in other words, he spent so much money that he needed to get some money back, he offered to sell them to the British nation, which required an Act of Parliament. So his second motivation was to recoup the money he had spent, again, not for the good of the British nation, but it was spent on his own behalf.
We have seen countless Greek governments and officials trying to make some headway when it comes to this dispute. Why do you think this is the case? Why are they not achieving their goal? What's wrong with their arguments?
Well, there are 2 points. As I say, the British Museum's case rests on a legality, which in my view is a false legality, because there is no historic basis for the alleged legal claim. But if you want to try to undo that, from my point of view, if you're a British person trying to get reunification, you have to persuade Parliament, not just the British Museum trustees, that the Act of 1816 should no longer be enforced, that it should be repealed, and that the marbles should therefore be free to return to their native home. But that's actually quite a difficult thing. If you imagine all the other issues that Parliament has to deal with. And currently we're talking about Ukraine, we're talking about the EU, we're talking about NATO, we're talking about extreme poverty in my country. So there are all sorts of issues that come ahead of the reunification of the Parthenon marbles.
Right, and just recently, the director of the Acropolis Museum called, he's the new director of the museum, and he once again called on the British Parliament to put an end to the issue, as we were just mentioning before you. He says it's a morally right thing to do. Boris Johnson was also in favor of returning the marbles back to the Greece. Do you think we can see him actually making some kind of action when it comes to this dispute?
We can't see the present Prime Minister, and I hope that quite soon he will no longer be our Prime Minister, wanting to move in the direction of reunification. As you rightly say, when he was a student, he was in favor of the reunification, and that indeed was for largely moral, ethical reasons. I personally have an extra reason, which is an archaeological aesthetic reason, but that's not necessary. You're quite right. The fundamental issue now is ethical, moral, and we are taking our lead, or we're following along in the same lines as those who believe, for example, the African treasures stolen, for example, from Nigeria, which are going to be returned to Nigeria, the Benin bronzes. That's the line that we believe our government, following the French government, President Macron, should take. But there is absolutely no sign of that happening anytime soon. And one reason is a kind of nationalism. One of the sort of emotional arguments the British Museum puts forward is that we, as it were, have done the marbles a great service by curating them for 200 years. We therefore deserve to hang on to them. That seems to me a very old-fashioned, reactionary, I would say immoral point of view.
Now, the Parthenon in Athens is being restored at the moment. I myself was there just recently. How significant would it be for the marbles to be one day returned to their original place?
Well, I believe it's one of those world historical, cultural issues. And we sometimes make an analogy. It's not a perfect one, of course, but imagine the Mona Lisa being cut in half, and half of it's in Paris and half of it's in Italy. We don't think that's the right way for a unified monument to go. It should be, as far as possible, reassembled. And the new Acropolis Museum, which, as you say, has a new director, Nikos Stambolidis, a friend of mine, that has the best possible view of the Acropolis. And we must remember the Parthenon is an integral monument of the ancient Athenian Acropolis. And so it's not enough to think of it merely as a work of art, merely as a museum piece. It's part of a living heritage. Of course, the Parthenon is very far from complete. It was blown up in 1687. I won't go into all those details, but nevertheless, to get them back, as many as possible, as near as possible, in the best possible viewing platform, which is the top gallery of the Acropolis Museum in Athens.
Right. There are so many artifacts in different museums around the world. This is not the only case, but seems like this particular case is so unique. Why do you think it's so unique? Why is this dispute? I mean, we've mentioned it, it's been more than 2 centuries that hasn't been resolved.
Well, you've made a very, I mean, to me, the essence of the case, which is that it's unique. I could quite understand if museum curators and directors were worried that the reunification of the Parthenon marbles set a precedent for any other artifacts. And we actually say that the Parthenon is a unique case for 2 reasons, really. One, because the Parthenon, the essence of the Parthenon, still stands on the Acropolis. And secondly, the way in which the British Museum displays what it has of the Parthenon, you can see on your screen, is extremely poor because it gives a very bad impression of what the original looked like. It's on the inside of a building. The pieces of the frieze are all in the wrong place, and they're not happily displayed in a rather dark room with, until recently, a leaking roof. I mean, things were really pretty bad. So for all those reasons, curation and the existence of the basic part of the Parthenon on the Acropolis, those are the 2 principal arguments for reunification as a unique case.
Thank you so much, Paul Cartledge, a professor of Greek culture at Cambridge University. I really appreciate your insight. Have you ever seen a lion cub wandering in your neighborhood? Well, that's exactly what happened in Montenegro's coastal city of Budva last month. Authorities discovered a lion cub inside an unfinished house after it escaped from a private residence. According to an animal protection agency, the cub was walking around the Adriatic Sea resort for a month before being found. Montenegro has no zoo to take in exotic animals, and the discovery of the lion cub has exposed the dangers of illegally trafficking wild animals in the Western Balkans. Mirjana Miladinovic has more from Podgorica.
Residents call emergency lines saying they could hear the roar of a lion. Others complain their chickens and rabbits were being eaten.
On je ovdje bio i on mu bacao kobasicu. I lav je onda odatle pobjegao, mladunče lava, to on je imao oko jednu 50 50 kila možda. Niko mu nije vjerovao, čak su mu ljudi vikali šta ti to pušiš, šta si se napušio, on niti konzumira alkohol, niti kakve supstance, droga, ništa.
After escaping a private home, the lion was at large for almost 3 weeks before being captured by police. The danger was gone, but the long-time problem of Montenegro remains. The country has no zoo to take in exotic animals. It's illegal for people to keep these animals as pets in Montenegro without permission or adequate homes, but that law has done little to stop smugglers. Customs agents intercepted a boa constrictor and 2 endangered Siberian tigers at the border. And since they had no place for these animals, they returned them to the owners. Later, one of the tigers bit off the arm of the owner's mother.
Znamo da je zadnjih 2 godine dosta je toga ušlo u Crnu Goru, a da carinske vlasti to nisu registrovale. Mi kao agencija imali smo prije mjesec dana, polovinom januara mjeseca smo imali zapljenu 2 afričke ostrigaste kornjače. Po 40-50 kila su ogromne kornjače, stare nekoliko desetina godina, otprilike kao pola pilates lopte. Eto, toliko su velike, znači ne radi se baš o nekoj maloj kornjači da ona može da se stavi u kofer ili nekako da se prokrijumčari, a da stvarno carinik ne može to da vidi. Imali smo slučaj prije 3-4 godine da je čovjek prokrijumčario 2 emua. To je ptica veličine 1,5 m, 2 i to prođe i pitamo ga kako. Bili su na zadnjem sjedištu, kao na zadnjem sjedištu auta, prošli su kao što prolaze i ljudi preko granice.
Some owners gave us videos of their exotic pets, but with one condition, that we don't mention their names.
Even though in Montenegro there isn't official zoo, there is one place outside of capital Podgorica where you can see a lot of species from other continents.
Here you can feed a camel, run with emus and see other unusual animals.
2005. godine zajedno sa svojom porodicom sam odlučio da porodično imanje koje nam je ostavio djed iskoristimo za dobrobit divljih i egzotičnih životinja. Isključivo i samo iz razloga što u Crnoj Gori ni tada kao ni danas nije postojalo prihvatilište koje se bavi tim pitanjem.
Most of those animals are free to roam and interact with people.
Beko, jesi pomogla, jesi pomogla, debeli. Ajde sam moja mala, kakav si.
This is Ljubo, a bear who came here when he was only a few months old.
Now, Ljubo is 4. He's one of the few animals here at the enclosure. The Miličković family has offered to give their land to the state for free, on the condition that it keeps it as a shelter or a zoo. They offered to take in the Budva lion as well, just so he could stay in Montenegro. But officials say no animal can be happy and healthy living in a small space. So they've made arrangements to return him to his natural habitat with the help of a non-profit organization.
Radimo na tome da ga ovo prihvatilište 4 šape sa sjedištem u Holandiji prihvati. On je još mali da bi se mogao sam u prirodi snalaziti, da ga prihvati, da ga ojača i onda ga transportuje u Južnoafričku republiku gdje ima svoje prihvatilište površine 5000 hektara.
Montenegro remains an attractive route for smugglers. Some of them are seized at customs, but without anywhere to go. Montenegrin authorities now have plans to build an official shelter. But the question is, when will it open and who will care for the animals in the meantime? Mirjana Miladinovic, TRT World, Podgorica, Montenegro.
Hope the animals will stay safe until Montenegro opens an official wildlife shelter. Thanks for watching this episode of Across the Balkans. From me and the team, bye-bye for now. See you next time.